Hello everyone, welcome to the Northeast Georgia History Center. We have a great members live stream for you today, but first I want to let you know, obviously this is pre-recorded so that we can all take this time off, but we hope you had a great Thanksgiving. And here it is today, Friday, it's Native American Heritage Day, and so we bring a special episode to you about culture and conflict. And really what I want to do with this is to look at Native Americans but through the eyes of early American explorers and illustrators, because Native Americans, when first contact occurred, are in effect prehistoric people. Now, we don't mean cavemen and dinosaurs and saber-toothed tigers and things like that. What we mean is they haven't written history from their perspective. They don't have a written language, so they haven't recorded history in the traditional European sense. So we call that prehistoric. And as a result, unfortunately, almost everything we know about these early cultures comes from two sources: either archaeology or the illustrations and words by those Europeans who came here in the early days. Now, of course, that means that those sources, especially the ones from Europeans, have been through a filter. They've been biased, not necessarily maliciously, but of course they're going through the eyes of someone who doesn't really understand the culture, who hasn't lived through it. So today we want to look at some of those illustrations and glean from them what we can, but of course going into it literally and figuratively with our eyes wide open, looking at a primary source. Now, what is a primary source? In other words, how do we know what we know? So there are some guidelines that we always use to look at primary sources and place them in the proper context. So the most obvious is, what are the sources? Are they written? Are they part of a diary? Are they illustrations that were done by someone who just was taken by the scene before them? And what is each source's purpose? Again, if it's written, was it a narrative? Was it a diary? Was it something to actually record the lives of the Native Americans? Or, as often happened in early America, was it being written sort of as a promotional piece to get colonists encouraged and excited to come over to the New World? And who created it and when? Was it a marketing person for one of the colonies? Did they create this after they had already come back from the New World after years and years, and they're relying on their memory for such things? So you always have to take those things into account. What was the bias and point of view of the person creating the original source? If they're a European, obviously they're going to have all of that cultural baggage that comes along with being a European. And the things they see in their own mind may be different than what the Native Americans themselves intend or experience. And, also what's going on in the region and in the world when this primary source is being created. Are there wars? Is there famine? Are there efforts? Are there good relations with the Native Americans? Are there bad relations with the Native Americans? Things like that you also have to take into account. And how do these things connect to what we already know? And this is where archaeology and these original sources can really come together. A lot of the archaeology we're able to do, of course, are things that they themselves, the Native Americans, left in the ground on purpose or accidentally. The layout of their villages and things like that. And that's a very scientific approach, but of course it's also very incomplete. All we have left is what has lasted through centuries of being exposed to the elements. So when we can use different tools from the historian's toolbox, like archaeology, like these drawings, we come to a better set of understanding. And of course, putting this all together, what does this help us understand from history? Now, that's a very, very complex thing, and one of the interesting things about historians who look at primary documents, of course, is that a different historian can reach a different conclusion, either radically different or only slightly different. But we want to keep that sort of thing in mind as we go through some of these illustrations. Now, the first group of illustrations we want to talk about were originally done by a fellow named Jacques Lemoyne, who was a Frenchman who came over on one of the very early French expeditions to Florida. Now, we usually think of Florida as primarily a Spanish-controlled area, and it became that, but in the very early days, the New World was up for grabs for all those European colonists, and Lemoyne came with one of those expeditions that went into Florida and created a Fort Caroline and places like that, that eventually the French get pushed out by the Spanish, and Florida comes under Spanish control and remains that way until the United States takes it over in the 1820s. But being a Frenchman on that expedition means he was making these watercolors as he went. And as we understand it, almost all of the drawings that he did on this expedition of the original native inhabitants were destroyed in the Spanish attack on Fort Caroline. And so when he gets back to Europe, of course, they begin to publish works on this, and it's a thing. People want to see images of the New World and of the exotic people who live there. So to do that in this time period, they have to go to an engraver. And he goes to an engraver named Theodore de Brie, who was in the Netherlands and ran an engraving house. And so Lemoyne's originals are destroyed. And what he has to do is sort of describe to de Brie what he had drawn, and he might do some sketches. Well, it kind of looked like this, it kind of looked like that. So he's removed geographically from the time and place. He's removed temporally from the time and place. He's having to rely on memory, and then it's having to be filtered through the engraver. So a lot of the things in these following illustrations may not be exact. Some, not all, but some scholarship has suggested that they are very unreliable, but they're kind of all we have to go on for the Timucuan people that inhabited what is now much of northern Florida. So on the screen, what you see is an original watercolor by Lemoyne of some local fruit in Florida. 5 or 6 of those did survive. And then you see an engraving by de Brie there of natives having to fight off an alligator. Now, we don't know if the alligators were actually that big back in the day. They very well could have been. We just don't know. Again, this is going by memory. But want to go through some of these drawings, or I should say engravings, by de Brie that are based on Lemoyne's recollections and sketches, and see what we can discover from them. So we'll go ahead and start off with this first one. Now, they're named, as a side note, many of these earlier drawings are named with very long names. That's just how people did things. When you go to titles of books in this time period, the entire first page is usually taken up by the title. I think that's kind of cool, but take it as you will. So, ceremonies performed by SATURIOUA before going on an expedition against the enemy, 1564. So this is about the time period when, this is not when they're being engraved. These dates, by the way, are when Lemoyne is actually in Florida. And you can see there, you're getting sort of a hint of a lot of different things of the material culture, if we can rely on these. And for the moment, let's assume that we can just rely on these and take them for what they are. You have the dress of the Native Americans. You have very interesting hairstyles. Of course, this looks very exotic. And there's not a lot of clothing going on with these Native Americans. And that tends to be borne out by the written evidence that we have as well. And this is also, of course, this is a ceremony. So what the Lemoyne is really trying to describe here is a ceremony being done. And you see in the background, you see mostly men. Well, that could tell us that these ceremonies, or at least certain ceremonies, could involve only men. And you see there in the middle some baskets of what we presume is grain or some goods. We're not sure, is that a sacrifice? Is this the food that will be given to the people on the expedition? Is it going to be blessed by the ceremony for sustenance, things like that? We see some of their weapons. If you look closely at the spear in the foreground sitting next to those baskets, you can see the spear tip. And best we can understand, that means that's probably a flint spear tip, because remember, this is the very earliest, some of the earliest illustrations we have of Native Americans. So they're going to be using flint weapons. This is well before steel and metallurgy. And for that matter, given the European audience that this is going to be, some of the private parts of these Native Americans are covered up. In real life, they may not have been, but for the audience for which this was intended, they probably were not willing to go that far to show how things were exactly. But you can see just a lot of different details of material culture in this. And these drawings by Lemoyne that have been filtered through debris are really sort of the only basis we have for what the appearance of these Native Americans was going to be. We can go to the next one. And we have here a construction of the fortified towns among the Floridians. And this can also give you some appreciation, perhaps not to scale. This obviously is not quite to scale, but it can show a layout. And again, when you put these things together with archaeology, when you put these things together with written sources, a better, clearer image of what life was for these Native Americans begins to emerge. You see the long, larger central house in the middle there. You see that must have been a ceremonial and a government center. Now, they're not going to use the word government, but the chief may live there. That may be where the indoor religious ceremonies take place. And it's surrounded by smaller structures that are going to be living spaces, that are going to be storage spaces. And on the very outskirts of town, you're going to see what looks like crops, which tells us that they're going to be growing their crops inside the protective palisade as well as outside. And when you look at the gateway to the palisade, you can tell this is very much designed not for keeping animals out of the garden, though that was, I'm sure, a nice side effect. This is for defense. This is to prevent attack against the village. You can see that from the way the entryway into the village is shown. It's that sort of staggered gateway that you have to run the gamut through. And on either side of it is what, to European eyes at least, is being interpreted as a fortified gatehouse. So those are larger structures. They're different from the living structures, which tells us that they had some other function. Again, being that close to the gate tells us that they are defensive in nature. But really interesting ways. You can even get a little bit on how those structures might have been created. They're all round, probably post out of the ground with some sort of walls in between and a cone-shaped thatched roof on the top. And when we go to our next one, you're going to see one of those a little bit closer. The industry of the Floridians depositing their crops in the public granary. Again, European description. A granary, of course, is a European word that means a storehouse for grains, but lots of interesting things going on in this picture. You see a structure closer up in the background. You can see that that is indeed probably a thatched roof. You can see that there's a doorway, but not a door. And you can also see something that is very, very commonly attributed in the older illustrations in the written works, a dugout canoe. Now, dugout is very, very common in the Southeast. Usually we think of tree bark or skin stretched over a frame for a canoe. That's usually a northeastern type of vessel. Here in the Southeast, the Native Americans, all the way up into the 1800s, are using dugout canoes. You take a big log, you shape it with the tools that you have available, whether that's a later iron tool or an earlier stone tool, and we'll get to some details of that in a second. But here they have food inside the dugout canoe. They're moving it via water, which means that the place they're gathering the food isn't exactly probably within the village. This may be from another farm. This may be from fruit gathered in the forest being brought to the granary. And you notice that there are both men and women in the canoe, which can also perhaps give us a hint that when the food is being gathered and brought to a central location, that both men and women participated in that process. And going to the next one, you can see that this is the mode of tilling and planting. And again, you can also see a little bit of a division of labor here, as well as some hints. Notice there are no plows, right? This is very much a pre-animal powered society and culture. And best we can tell, across the continent, Native Americans, at least the North American continent, Native Americans had only domesticated dogs. There were no other domesticated animals for food, much less to do labor for pulling plows, for pulling wagons, things like that. You can see the small holes in the ground, sort of giving an indication of what planting was. Very common practice. You would take a stick, as you can see the fellow in the background, poke a hole in the ground, and then coming behind, seeds would be placed into those holes, and then it would be covered back up. And again, you see a small basket here that has what is presumably the seeds, and you see a division of labor. You see the men doing sort of the heavy digging work there in the foreground, doing some of the hacking out of the ditches for drainage and the hills, and then the women are coming behind and placing the seeds within the different holes. So you see, just trying to analyze some of these primary sources, you can really get a lot from it. Now, proceedings of the Floridians in deliberating and important affairs. This gives us, hopefully, some idea of what it was like for the Indians to sort of have their government. And again, government is obviously a very European word, and when I say that, it has its own baggage. But Native Americans had a very different approach to how they would decide things on a tribal scale and on an individual and family scale. And depending upon what tribe we're talking about, some of the family-sized decisions that would be made would involve a lot more women, because a lot of these cultures were matriarchal rather than patriarchal, especially the Cherokee. So you see here that they have sort of a central gathering area, and again, here in this instance, it's primarily men. Women are there, but they're sort of preparing meals. They're not really engaging in the decision-making process. They're sort of, auxiliary to that. And we have someone here speaking. You also see, this is very interesting. This is something interesting that is also borne out by some written descriptions. If you look at this image, the second guy from the right looks kind of like he's vomiting, doesn't it? One of those little details. We have some written descriptions of some of these ceremonies. The men would want to purify themselves so that they could think clearly and that their spirit would be pure. And so they would take herbs that would be purgatives. It would basically cause them to vomit, which would, in this perspective, sort of clear the mind and clear the body. So it's very interesting to see that little detail in there. On the far left, you can see someone that looks like perhaps has a vessel, and they're passing around this drink so that they can continue with the ceremony. And in the foreground, just as a note, you see some of the French, and they're very European. They have gunpowder weapons, they have doublets, they have helmets, they have swords and things like that. But they're obviously waiting on the Indians to decide something with them. Whether it's a military operation, that's probably what's being hinted at with the weaponry, but we can't really be sure. Now, we come to another set of drawings from this earlier period. There's a fellow named John White, who is actually an early governor of Virginia. And he has also done some watercolors, and he was commissioned by the Privy, I can't remember if it was the Privy Council, someone in power in England, to record the life of the natives. And so as a somewhat accomplished artist, he undertook this. When his drawings were sent, they were also sent, ironically, to the same guy who did Lemoyne's drawings, Debris, and he did an engraving so that they could be published. But we're fortunate here, sort of want to show you a comparison. So here on the left is one of John White's original watercolors, and on the right is Debris' engraving. And you can see there are similarities. There are differences, ranging from the posture of people. Of course, you can't have coloration in the engravings. Some of the dress is similar. Some of it is a little more fanciful. Just to give you an idea, and this is very important, of how things can be filtered and changed as they move through. So John White is a primary source, mostly. Debris, is he truly a primary source? Maybe not. He might be like a secondary source or even a tertiary source, but again, perhaps the closest that we have. But that's what we have to go on. So when you begin looking at some of the originals as they're transferred into engravings, keep that in mind. So the next one we have is a WEROAN, or Great Lord of Virginia. This is 1580, so that's about 20 years after the French expedition to Florida. And you see here, again, very typical native dress and very typical native weaponry. You can see they have a bow with the long arrows. You can see the headdress. You can see the well-apportioned the Native Americans are. many of these original Native American tribes along the coast, the Europeans remarked on how very tall they were. Some of them 2 to 3 inches taller than the average European, which is a very interesting take on things. So we have here, and again, you can see that White is really trying to record things as close as he can for posterity, and Debris continuing that. So here we have a lord, a man, a warrior from Virginia. And the next picture we have is of a female and child, a chief lady of the village. And you can see here she's holding a clay jar, which probably indicates, again, rather than a warrior whose job is to fight, here we have someone who is more in the domestic sphere and has a child who is playing with some Native American toys, which is a really cool thing, actually, when you think about it. What did Native American kids play with? This may be one of our best chances to see what that might have been. And going to some of these next ones, this is the thing I was telling you about before, these dugout canoes. So in the first one, their manner of fishing in Virginia, when you look at the details of this is really interesting because he's gone into great detail to show the different kinds. In the very background, you see guys with spears out in the stream or the river actually just spearing the fish, which tells me that they're very, very plentiful. You have a fish weir made of sort of to the left background of sticks and barriers so that the fish will go into it, and then basically they're trapped and people can just go in there and pick the fish out of the reservoir. And then you have in the foreground a dugout canoe with some folks in it who are going to be fishing that way, and you can see some fish that are already in the canoe. And then White is very interesting, obviously, the manner of them making their boats. And again, dugout canoe, they would fell a tree, they would shape the front and the back to be just a little more hydrodynamic, and then they would burn the top, right? They would use what tools they have, and you can see one fellow there on the right has what looks like a seashell, perhaps. Again, this is not going to be with iron tools. This is going to be with flint or with a seashell. And a seashell is going to work because they're burning the boat to char the top and make it easier to dig out. And they're going to do that, burn it, dig it, burn it, dig it, burn it, dig it. And there's some great experimental archaeology that has been done that has helped us understand this process. And it is a laborious process, but then you end up with a very sturdy, very long-lasting water vessel that can carry a lot of weight. So really neat things you can discover from there. Also from this same series is the town of Scioto in 1585. And this one I think is very, very interesting because they've tried to include a lot of information into this one drawing. So I've split this one in half, and we can look at the top half first. In the top half, you of course get to see some of the structures. You get to see, again, some crops that have a barrier around them. You get to see roads, or maybe not roads, let's say streets. You get to see streets a little bit more closely. You get to see a different variety of the crops that are being planted. And again, some of the people there, some of the dress. And then when you go to the second close-up, you can see there's another ceremonial area there, sort of in a circle where they're having a ceremony, they're dancing around, they're moving things through the streets, supplies and things like that. So someone who wanted to understand how the towns were in this time period could take some archaeology, take this drawing, and see if they could reconcile some of those really, really important and interesting facts. But again, there's filters there. You've got to be careful when you do this. But sometimes this is the best we have. We think that the work by Debris on John White is probably more reliable than that with Lemoyne, simply because that comparison I showed you, that it is much, much closer. Maybe that means that Debris' engravings of Lemoyne were also somewhat reliable, but what I'm trying to say is the further forward in time we go, the closer we get to us, the more reliable a lot of these images are going to be, and that's going to come out in some of the next ones. So the next ones, skipping a bit, these are actually a couple from Georgia. So we have Indians hunting in Georgia from 1736 from a fellow named Von Rech. who was a explorer here. He came, of course, Georgia was founded in 1733, so this is only about 3 years after the founding. It's a fascinating book. He kept a journal and did a lot of drawings of his voyages in Georgia, and it is one of arguably the best resources we have for what Georgia was like in these very, very early days of the colony. And this is another very fascinating drawing, and quite frankly, I think this one is pretty reliable. You see here a man and a woman, and you see here a mixing of the two cultures. By this point, trade has opened up between the Europeans and between the Native Americans, and there's an exchange going back and forth, especially here in the Southeast, the trade of deer skins for manufactured goods. So the man on the right, you can see he actually has a gunpowder weapon. He has a flintlock trade musket. He has on a woven wool blanket. He has on leggings that are also probably of woven cloth. However, there's still a lot of native aspects to it. You can see the decoration of his moccasins. You can see the little bundle that he has on his back. You can see the hairstyle, the classic hairstyle. These are probably Creeks, possibly Cherokees, but probably more along the Muskogee people, the Creeks. And then behind him, you have someone else who has a more traditional weapon with bows and arrows. But by this point, maybe you don't want to push this too far. You can see the point of the arrow is much more regular. And if a Native American who was wanting to hunt couldn't afford an entire musket, he could probably afford a trade for iron arrowheads, and he would make the arrows and the bow in the exact same manner that he always had. But those iron arrowheads are going to be a little bit easier to put on, and they're going to be a little more effective in penetrating the game and causing more blood loss, which leads to harvesting the deer more effectively and more reliably. Also has the bundle on their back that's probably going to have some basic supplies, some food, and the things they're going to need to preserve the deer skins once they get them. So that's a really neat drawing. Another one by Von Rick. This is 36 to 38. He was here a couple of years, we're not exactly sure, of an Indian busk ceremony or a corn ceremony. And they had a couple of these, 2 or 3 of these in Savannah. Oglethorpe would go to these, and this was a great way. The Native Americans celebrated around the harvest time, much as Europeans do. It seems to be a cultural constant throughout human history. But celebrating a harvest or wanting to ensure a good harvest becomes a ceremonial feature that brings a lot of different people together into a central place with ceremonies, celebrations, feasting, and things like that. So Von Rick has captured a great image here of a lot of different things going on. In the foreground, you see some folks dancing and probably maybe even playing a game. You see to the right a group of folks gathered around, probably talking, probably celebrating, perhaps singing some songs. And then in the background, you see what a structure would have looked like. It probably a temporary structure like the likes of which they would have put up when they traveled to somewhere else. Now, of course, Europeans are going to use cloth tents, but the Native Americans are much more practical. They're going to use the resources that are available to them from a natural perspective in the forest. And so they have sort of a shed here built of saplings and stripped bark, like a third or a half of the bark from a tree. They're just going to strip that down and lay them across for a roof. And that's going to allow a lot of people to gather together, to have these ceremonies, to have these songs and things like that. And Von Rick also goes into some detail describing these from in a written way. Again, it's not just the drawings, it's the journal that he left, and creates a really, really rich picture of Native Americans in early Georgia history. Sort of along the same lines, to give you an indication of how international things still were, this is a French commission piece. Let me back up. So the French are still in the Southeast, right? They are in Louisiana, they are in New Orleans, and they are also interacting with the Creeks and the Cherokees for the deerskin trade. And so we have a drawing here from the Cherokee Commission relating to a fellow named Oconostota, who is a leader amongst the Cherokee. And we have this small part of this drawing that shows on the right, obviously a European officer, a man of some standing, engaged in trade with a native man. And again, it's a great little bit of detail about native appearance and material culture. Again, they have a flintlock. If you want to get super detailed, you can see that they have that traditional French stock on that musket, because these are French people they're trading with, so their muskets are probably going to come from the French. They have a woven cloth top, but they have their bag by their side that's going to hold their things. Their face is painted, which was very ceremonial, whether for war or for diplomacy. Feathers in their hair. And an interesting detail here, their moccasins on their feet are sort of turned up. Notice that they're kind of tall for moccasins. Sometimes we think of moccasins as only being ankle tall, but these appear to be quite tall, going up even to mid-calf. And it also is used to show this interaction between the Europeans and the Native Americans, culturally, economically, even sometimes militarily and politically. But another great drawing from the early days, 1761. Now, what? The French in Georgia talking to the Creeks and the Cherokees? Well, the British must have something to say about that. So one of the things they did just the following year is they invited several headmen from the Cherokee Nation to go to London and be presented to the king so that they could sort of have this diplomatic exchange, a goodwill tour. And we have here a fellow named Bickham drew a picture of these Cherokee who had come to London in 1762. And you can see lots of great details on the native dress. And this one, as far as we can tell, was probably taken from life. You see the fellow on the left, obviously not a Native American, but a European with a dog. By this point, by the way, in the 18th century, artists loved to just put dogs and stuff. I guess they thought it was cool. It is kind of cool. But you see here, the Native Americans have this remarkable mix of European and native dress, native styles. They have woven cloth, they have blankets, but on the blankets they have a lot of beads, a lot of weaving. And remember, this is going to be their ceremonial gear. They're going to London. They're going to want to show off their status and who they are. So they have really fanciful face painting. They have really detailed hair and makeup. They've got earrings in. They have beadwork all over them, because beads, of course, are a great indicator of rank and of position within Cherokee society. And so this is going, and again, what is the purpose of these drawings? Go back to that aspect. So was the audience for this the Native Americans? No, not even remotely. The audience for this drawing was the British and Londoners, to show that London, that England, that the empire was involved in trade in the New World. So people should go to the colonies, so people should engage in trade with the New World, because look, we have distinguished individuals coming from the New World to meet with us. So obviously we are winning the great game of empire. This is not remotely for consumption on the North American side of the Atlantic. This is for consumption in England and in Europe. Now, as the time goes on, there's the French and Indian War that takes place in North America, and eventually comes the Revolution, the American Revolution, and there's still a lot of things going on. The Native Americans play a huge role in that. But there's an incredibly interesting fellow that we study here at the Northeast Georgia History Center a lot, named William Bartram. William Bartram is a fascinating man. He's a naturalist. He was born in Philadelphia, and he has come south, and he spends several years going through Florida, the Carolinas, Georgia, Alabama, and his real passion is, like I said, he's a naturalist. He's doing these fantastic studies of the native flora and fauna, but as a result of his travels, he's also engaging and interacting a lot with Native American tribes. And so this is a drawing that he has left to us of a Creek headman, Miko Kluko, or Chluko, we're not exactly sure, but this is circa 1755, so this is right around the time of when the French and Indian War is starting to kick off. Bartram does these travels for well over 10, 20 years. For a quarter of a century, he's in the Southeast recording things. But you can see this is a Muskogee person from the Seminoles in very, very southern Georgia and Alabama and northern Florida and a little deeper into middle Florida. a feather cape, lots of headdress. But notice he has an iron axe, which is going to be something he's acquired in trade with the British or with the French. There's a lot of engagement going on here, and a lot of these drawings begin to try to express the power of empires, the power of the headmen, not only of the Native Americans, but of the European powers there too. They're trying to show how this interaction is taking place in terms of who's controlling the continent. Again, the audience for this is not going to be the Seminoles, it's going to be Europeans. Now, as we get a little bit further along and a little closer to our time, people are going to go into the backcountry and begin to record things as Lemoyne did, as White did, simply trying to capture the everyday life of those who lived on the land. So here in 1791, we have a creek log habitation by a fellow named Tidball, and this is an absolutely fascinating piece. I always show this one to people who say, well, Indians didn't build log cabins. Of course they did. Native Americans are incredibly adaptive. They know how to use natural resources, certainly, and in their interactions with Europeans, there is a huge cultural exchange that goes on in terms of diet, in terms of family structure, in terms of economics, in terms of government, in terms of male-female relationships and labor divisions. All sorts of things start to happen that unfortunately we don't have time to go into here. But this is a great example to show how the Native Americans are beginning to adapt some of these European methods of building houses and structures. Earlier, and this is something you can see in the illustrations, earlier on you saw that most of the houses were round. Within Native American culture, round things were much more natural, spiritually pure, and desirable. As time has gone on, however, they're beginning to adapt things that may not fit in with that worldview, but are certainly more convenient and perhaps have a little bit more longevity to them, like this log cabin, built of logs, very square, right? This is not a traditional Native American structure or shape. It's sort of the antithesis of that, and yet they're beginning to adopt things. But nevertheless, you see crops in the background being worked and natives in front, dressed in traditional native dress, smoking pipes and things like that. And you have what comes to define the frontier, this interaction and intersection of European and native cultures, which defines the relationship for the rest of the time the Indians are in the East. And you can see that a lot in the next couple of drawings. We have here a fellow named Hyde. By the 1820s, a Cherokee person. And again, they're using woven cloth. Plain, you see those moccasins seems to have gone back down to what we think of moccasins being. They have what we think is a blow dart or a blowgun, something like that, that's going to be used for hunting, not for warfare. But you do have that tump line, that little bundle of goods and supplies on the back, and the blanket coat, frock, whatever you want to call it, is sort of belted there at the waist. And then there's a fellow who comes through by the name of Basil Hall. He is a British Army officer, but as very frequently happened in the 19th century, they wanted to take a holiday for a year or two and go to the wild places in the world and get some adventure and get some knowledge. And so Basil Hall decides to come to the wildness that is the southeastern United States. So he begins a tour and comes in and goes through Charleston, goes down into Georgia, crosses pretty close here to Gainesville, goes through Macon, goes into Alabama. Here's the interesting thing about his drawings. He's a good artist, but he's using something called a camera obscura. And in effect, this is a couple of pieces of glass that reflect the image of what he's looking at onto a piece of paper, which you can then trace, right? So what that means is that these are taken from life, and therefore, while he may be getting some of the details wrong, they're a pretty close approximation and representation of what would have actually been. Now, he came through in the 1820s, 1828, 1830, something like that. And so this drawing that he has here, Chiefs of the Creek Nation, and I left this part out, and a Georgia squatter. So the fellow on the left, the fellow on the right are representatives of the Creek Nation. They're chiefs. And you can see, again, that perfect mix of European and Native American manufactured goods, handmade items that start to define what a Native American is supposed to look like, especially from a traditional and ceremonial point of view. You see multicolored cloth, you see leggings, you see moccasins, you see the turban-like headdress. But notice that they're sitting in chairs, right? This is a very assimilated group of people. And in the background, as I said, is a Georgia squatter. This is what a typical frontiersman in Georgia is going to look like in the 1820s. And really, this is the look that you're going to have up until removal occurs in the 1830s. And so we've sort of gotten to the point where we're getting close to, we're not at photographs yet, but we're at portraiture. And I haven't included any portraiture yet, but I will come back to that in a second. So you can take a good look at all these different images, and using those guidelines that we established at first, you can start to look at some of these images on your own. And there are a wide variety more than I have covered in this presentation. And I want to share with you a couple of good sources to look at those. A lot of the early drawings that I used for this presentation came from a book called Southeastern Indian Life Portraits, edited by Emma Lilla Funderburk. And this is it's paper bound, it's black and white, but that's okay. The engravings were black and white too. And she goes through and has accumulated a lot of these drawings and engravings, specifically obviously for Southeast Indians, in one volume. It is a very cool book, and it's easily available on Amazon if that's the sort of thing that interests you. If you want to hone down into some Georgia history and early Native Americans here in this state, there's a really cool book by the Beehive Press called Von Recht's Voyage, Drawings, and Journal. And it reproduces his watercolors in color. It includes most of his journals, which fortunately have been translated from the original German to English. So it's a really, really great resource for those early times. And as I said, getting into the 1820s, 1810s, 20s, and 30s, and 40s, the current rage, you could say, in the United States was for portraits of many of these Native American leaders. And to meet that demand, fellows named McKinney and Hall had sort of established this portrait shop. And most of these, not all of them, but most of the portraits they have created are done from a sitting. They would have the person actually sit for them, and they would draw it out. And when you look at them, you see varying degrees of native dress, moving in slowly into very traditional European dress. And other than a couple of distinct facial features and the title of the portrait, you wouldn't know that they were Native Americans at all. But the portraits, again, are really meant to commemorate Native Americans and their stories, and sort of almost a way to commemorate something that even folks then knew was going to be disappearing from the eastern part of the United States and the Southeast. So they're not super informative in terms of material culture, but they do give you an idea of what these folks may have looked like and the ideas of the time in terms of how they were viewed by those doing the portraits. And the single best volume to kind of pull those together is edited by James Horan, called the McKinney Hall Portrait Gallery of American Indians. And this, they sort of go, like I said, back in the 1820s all the way up into the 1840s and 50s, to some of those, the Plains Indians chiefs and things like that. It's a really fascinating look at a lot of those different portraits of Native Americans. So what we've done today, hopefully, is whet your appetite for looking at some of these primary documents, but doing it with a very, very critical eye and not taking everything you see as gospel just like that. There's a lot of interpretation and a lot of informed analysis that you have to do with any primary source, especially ones like the early ones by Lemoyne and White that have been filtered in so many ways and may be questionable. And yet we're absolutely drawn to them because they're images. We can read journals and get some idea of what life might have been like. We can look at the archaeology, but that's sometimes even harder to imagine and wrap our heads around and think about how things actually look. But these early illustrations They may be the European perspectives on things, but they're the best we have to try and understand those who inhabited this land first. Folks, thanks for tuning in. That's all the time we have today. I hope to see you again soon at the Northeast Georgia History Center. And until then, I hope you stay safe, take care, and keep an eye on our Facebook and our website to know what great events we have coming up, including our telethon on December 4th. Be sure and tune in. See you later.